I'm managing director at BVI, which is not British Virgin Islands, so I'm not selling you a cruise trip today. But we are the Association of German Asset Managers. We have 104 members, which manage in slight excess of 3 trillion euros assets under management. And of those, about 2.7 trillion are in investment funds, which potentially fall under BMR. And to give you an idea, I have asked my statistical team to look at the amount of retail funds which our members manage, and these are about 9,900 ISINs, so it's not 9,000 asset pools, it's 9,900, nearly 10,000 ISINs, because obviously performance fees could be on one share class, while they couldn't be perhaps on another one. And just to give you an implication on what Marie-Claire was explaining and, in terms of what pertains to asset managers, we are essentially, if we use indices, caught in several ways. One is, which was clearly pointed out, in index replicating. Here I have indicated the ETFs in Germany. That would be about 5.6%. This number does not include index replicating funds which are not ETFs, but I think that's a small number. So this is a rough figure. Don't count on the individual one. The second part, which is also of interest, is the funds with performance fees. Again, these are all funds in our statistical database which are marked like that. Obviously, there are some funds included which do not base a performance fees on investment, on indices. For example, if a performance fee is based on a hurdle rate of 5%, that would probably not be an index. It's a number according to Article 3, but it's not regularly determined. So also take this with a caution, so it's just giving an impression. And then what has been referred to as asset allocation funds, in brackets on the slides of Marie-Claire, actively managed. That's the light gray and dark gray part. We don't have statistical information at this stage which of our member funds would refer in their investment policy or strategy to an index to determine the asset allocation. So for example, we do not know how many funds say we will buy equities only out of the stock 600 range, which would be one of the cases which could be caught here. And that's sort of why the light gray area is with a big question mark. So, but our initial feedback from our member indicates that that could be quite a large number, because actually a lot of funds refer simply in that way in determining their investment policy to an index. So the light gray part is probably underestimated. And then there remains a part which was also referred to as either not using indices at all, or as has been also explained, as a simple performance comparison. So simply saying the fund makes 10%, the stocks 50 makes 6%, so we are very good. That would not be caught. So that gives you an idea from a fund perspective what we are doing with. We are also not covering, and that's important for institutional investors, mandates are not caught by BMR. So if you have just a mandate as a pension fund with an asset manager, don't forget about BMR. Why and how are investment funds caught? One is, was already alluded to, all those which are now not dark gray in our assumption cannot use public indices anymore after 2020 if they are not in the ESMA register. So for that matter, it's obviously a huge impact on business policies. And specifically, we are caught in two ways, besides not being able to use sort of unregistered indices anymore, is we have to publish in case of UCITS, the index, that the index, the non-EU index, is in the ESMA register or the administrator of an EU benchmark. And we also have to provide, under Article 28, cessation plans, and also have to inform our clients in contractual relationships about that. In theory, members, when they produce indices for the benefit of investors, usually institutional investors, they could also be administrators, but in practice that is usually an activity which is engaged through outsourcing to an official index administrator like S&P. There's one issue I will be covering on the next slide where we are concerned. And we are also, perhaps with very few exemptions, usually not contributors to indices. So these two areas usually are not in scope in the discussion of my membership. Then on the slides, I sort of listed a few issues we are grappling right now with as EU fund managers. And I can say EU, not just German, because I'm also the chairman of EFAMA's benchmark task force. I already mentioned the first sub-point. Indices used for simple performance indication comparison are out of scope. That's a very welcome development. The next point, conversion of indices into another currency, relates to one issue which might be quite typical. If I look at S&P, they are providing a very good S&P 500 index. That is, if I'm not mistaken, denominated in dollars. And if you would base a performance fee for an investment fund on exceeding the S&P 500, but not expressed in dollars, but in euros, then you have the discussion is if that conversion, the multiplying the dollar with the euro rate or dividing by euro, is that producing a new index? And we have very little indication in the level 1 text for that, as you know, but there is a mentioning that a combination of indices can be used or is used, and then you have a recital 13 which says if there's no discretion involved. That's very little information available. We had time in Rome to discuss it intensively with Ms. Tambucci, but that is sort of, if there is no discretion involved, that would be the industry assumption that a simple then conversion into another currency would not constitute producing of a new index and therefore not put us into the realm of being an index provider or an index administrator. So most work right now is on the transitional provisions. One issue is, as we have to indicate in the UCITS prospectus or in the prospectus of a closed-ended AIF, but not in an open-ended AIF, the non-EU index used or the administration of an EU index used. We would like to know, obviously, which applications have been rejected, withdrawn, or otherwise not be dealt positively with, because obviously our members would not like to see a situation that they indicate in their prospectus that they use a certain index, and then to find out on the 1st of January 2020 that S&P was rejected, which we don't think so, but just to give you a practical example. And that is something we also discussed with ESMA and the NCAs, and unfortunately it seems that data protection laws, issues like that, are not allowing the NCAs and ESMA to divulge such information. So here we clearly advise our members to go to their index providers and make sure that they get from them, if possible, in contract form, their plans, how they want to deal with BMR. Then in the information on the index, our administrator needs to be included in the prospectus. There we are grappling with formulas how to describe that, because we essentially have to do it by the 1st of January 2019, while the index administrators have till 2020, as we have heard, and we would not like to write into the prospectus that the index provider is not in the register. And that is also the point, align the deadline to update prospectuses with the deadline to register, authorize the benchmarks. We are afraid that ESMA, although they are very willing to help us, cannot really do much, because these dates, 2019 and 2020, are fixed in the transitional provisions. Then, from a practical point of view, the ESMA register of administrators indices is obviously important, because we can only use those referenced. Mr. Tambucci said there are already six UK administrators in there. That's a start, but obviously it's a start. And it cannot be sort of very practical to look every day in the register to see whether a certain administrator has been registered or not. So therefore we would like to see, coming back on the last green point, that we essentially could say in the prospectus, we wait till, if they are in the register by 2020, and if possible can then update the prospectus thereafter. You know that UCITS prospectuses have to be shown to the regulator, in some cases approved, and that needs time too. And if you consider that an administrator has a 4-month period of getting the authorization through and it comes in on the last day, the registration process for the administrator plus a change in the usage prospectus takes several months, so we are well into 2021. Continuity plans. BaFin immediately sent us on the 20th of December as a Christmas present a survey. BaFin is the German SEC, saying, please describe what you have done for being prepared for the 1st of January 2020. And I thought, well, they tried to get us caught, my members caught with their pants down, sorry my expression. But that was not the case. We specifically asked about the requirements under Article 28, and one has to understand, obviously, investment fund providers are already regulated entities, so communication with supervisory authorities is not new for them. There is an established process, so this part of the cessation plans, communicating them on an appropriate time frame and updates to the supervisor is not a problem. Obviously, we had to rewrite robust written plans, but I stress rewrite. In most cases, there are already guidelines in the operational handbooks of asset managers how they structure their product governance guidelines, and they obviously would describe why you use a certain index or benchmark in a certain fund. And we also have some experience in replacing indices, usually not because they are not provided anymore. It's more that we get into contact with Joe's compatriots and discuss very heavily why they are so expensive. And sometimes they are too expensive, and you know publicly cases like Vanguard, where index providers have been changed because their valuable services are getting too expensive. So there is some experience with that, and that had to be included in the rewritten plans. Nominate one or several alternative benchmarks where feasible and appropriate. We are very grateful that level 1 is allowing that, because if you would have to indicate the replacement benchmark in the prospectus, let's say I have the FTSE 500, and I say replacement is the S&P 500. Doesn't make really sense, but let's assume it. Then Joe would come nicely along and say, by the way, you use the S&P 500, our minimum contract is $20,000 bucks. So we are very grateful that we don't need to indicate that in the prospectus, not in order to have the index providers come down on us and ask for fees even if we don't use the index. So obviously, where feasible, internally those lists will be made up, and sometimes it's not possible. The last point, critical benchmark, it's all fine that we need to prepare to be able to replace them, but there's nothing to replace right now because we don't have alternatives. There are no alternatives right now for Euribor, Ionia, and even for LIBOR. So there we have to wait for the regulators and the banking community to provide alternatives, but obviously the plans for that will be there. So we assume that the indication of general criteria and conditions for the selection of the index is sufficient in the robust plans. You don't have to name in each and every case an index, only where that is already appropriate right now. And we plan, because the law looking at other index-driven contexts like derivatives is not very clear on how you have to disclose the index use or the benchmark use to your own investors. It talks loosely about reflecting in the contractual documentation, but I think investment fund practice will be that it is usually in the fund prospectus. In very rare cases where it is in the part of the fund rules, that has also go through an approval by the relevant national NCA. Then there is one last aspect, and I think I'm done within the time, Steve, hopefully, as alignment of ESMA, ETFs, and other usage issues guidelines on the use of financial indices with BMR transparency requirement. In BMR, Joe and his compatriots did very successful lobbying. Users don't get any information or they pay for it. You only get the methodology, the rest you don't get. You don't even have you don't even get the price of the index. FTSE on a massive number of indices does not disclose the daily value. You have even to pay for that. Unfortunately, some, hopefully not so much my members, but more UK members have used these indices in their funds and are now stuck with having to publicize it and thereby at the same time even pay for something which the investor doesn't even see. So there we have to had a hard work in the level 1 and level 2 on transparency. We would have to have liked to see much more data than it is given to us. Also, the benchmark statement is quite limited. On the other hand, we have to use a lot of data according to the UCITS, ETF and other UCITS issues guidelines issued by ESMA under UCITS, interpretation of UCITS. So one of our aims this year we will get in a detailed discussion with ESMA, but not with Ms. Tambucci and Marie-Claire, but with the Mr. Starbo's team, because they have put the review of these guidelines on their work plan for 2018, and we need to make sure that the guidelines recognize what we get under BMR as information should be legally sufficient. But that will be another discussion. And last but not least, ongoing reform of Euribor, EONIA, and LIBOR. We are very actively interested. EFAMA, our association on the European level, is in the newly set up working group on these indices. We had also several members applying for it, but the practitioners were rejected. They might come in the sub-working groups, but you can be assured that the asset management industry will help also to give input on these subjects, even if these products are usually provided more by banks. That would be sort of a short roundabout what practical questions we are facing as associations and our members in the context of BMR and beyond. Thank you very much for your interest.